There is a fear that no amount of noise can drown out. You can fill the day with work, screens, conversation, and it waits patiently for the silence, the moment before sleep, the empty afternoon, the news of someone else's ending. The fear that one day you will simply stop being. Around 300 BC, a philosopher in Athens claimed this fear rests on a mistake so basic that once you see it clearly, the fear has nothing left to grip. His name was Epicurus, and his argument is not comfort. It is logic. Where most traditions offer consolation about an afterlife, Epicurus offered something stranger, a proof that death cannot harm you at all. In this video we will follow that argument from its first premise to its most disputed conclusion, and test whether it actually works. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe. Every video here is built around an idea worth your time. Epicurus put the core of it in a letter to a student named Menoeceus, in a line so compact it takes seconds to read and years to unpack: death is nothing to us. To understand the argument, you have to understand what Epicurus was trying to build. Around 306 BC he bought a house with a garden on the outskirts of Athens, and there he founded a school unlike the others, open to women and to slaves, which was scandalous for the time. The name became literal, they called it simply the garden. Its purpose was not abstract knowledge for its own sake, because Epicurus regarded philosophy as medicine for the soul, and medicine that heals nothing is worthless. The disease he wanted to cure was disturbance, what the Greeks called the opposite of ataraxia, that steady tranquility of a mind no longer at war with itself. He diagnosed the causes precisely. We are disturbed, he said, by false beliefs about the gods, by unnecessary desires, and above all by the fear of death. This last one he called the greatest source of anxiety, the shadow that darkens every pleasure because we know it will end. What this reveals is that for Epicurus the fear of death was not one problem among many. It was the master fear, the one that made a calm life impossible, which meant that dissolving it was the central task of his entire philosophy. He did not want you to be braver about dying. He wanted you to see there was nothing there to be brave about. But that promise only makes sense if the argument behind it holds, and to that argument we now turn. The whole thing turns on a single move, stated in the letter to Menoeceus. Death, Epicurus says, is the absence of sensation. All good and evil, he argues, consist in sensation, and death is the deprivation of sensation. From this he draws the conclusion that lands like a hammer, therefore death is nothing to us. Where death is present, we are not, and where we are present, death is not. The two never meet. Read it slowly, because the structure matters. As long as you exist, death has not arrived, there is nothing to suffer. And once death has arrived, you no longer exist, there is no one left to suffer it. The event you dread is one that, by definition, you will never be present for. It is not that death is a pain you will endure bravely. It is that death is not an experience at all, and only experiences can be good or bad for you. Honestly, this is the part that convinces me even when everything in my gut resists it. The fear pictures death as a state we somehow have to undergo, a darkness we sit inside. Epicurus points out there is no we inside it. The subject that could be harmed has been removed by the very thing we imagine harming it. But if the logic is this clean, why has it failed to comfort so many people for so long? That resistance is worth taking seriously, and it points to something the argument might be quietly assuming. Picture the ordinary version of this fear, the one that has nothing to do with philosophy lectures. It is the middle of the night. The house is quiet. And a thought arrives without invitation, the thought of not existing, of the world continuing on without you in it, of a future you will never see. The heart speeds up. You reach for the phone, for a distraction, for anything, because the thought feels unbearable. Notice what the mind is actually doing in that moment. It is not experiencing death. It is imagining death, and the imagining smuggles in something false. It places a version of you inside the nothingness, you who is aware of the darkness, aware of the absence, aware of missing out. That aware observer is precisely what death removes. What everyone gets wrong, and this is worth stating plainly, is that we do not fear death. We fear a picture of death that still contains us as a spectator. Epicurus would say the terror at 3 a.m. is the terror of a scene that cannot occur, because the scene requires a witness and death admits no witness. This is why the fear survives every distraction. Distraction cannot correct a belief, and the belief is a hidden error in how we picture the thing. Correct the picture, and the fear loses its object. And yet, correcting a picture is harder than it sounds, which brings us to the objection that gives Epicurus the most trouble. There is a caricature of Epicurus that has survived longer than his actual thought, and it distorts everything. The word Epicurean today means a lover of luxury, fine food, indulgence without limit. This is almost the exact opposite of what he taught. Epicurus lived simply, wrote that he could be happy on bread and water, and considered a jar of cheese an occasional luxury. His pleasure was not the pursuit of intense sensation but the removal of pain and disturbance. This correction matters for the argument on death, because it shows why he cared about it so much. Epicurus believed the goal of life was ataraxia and freedom from bodily pain, a settled contentment rather than a chase. The fear of death was fatal to that goal precisely because it could not be outrun by pleasure. No feast, no achievement, no distraction removes it, since the fear is not about any present pain but about a future absence. So when critics say Epicurus was avoiding the seriousness of death by declaring it nothing, I think they have it backwards. He took death more seriously than almost anyone, treating it as the single greatest obstacle to a good life, and he refused to answer it with a comforting story he did not believe. He answered it with an argument he thought was true. That intellectual honesty is exactly why the argument is worth pressing hard, including at the point where it seems most vulnerable. The Roman poet Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BC, extended Epicurus with an argument so elegant it deserves its own name. It is called the symmetry argument, and it appears in his poem on the nature of things. Consider the vast stretch of time before you were born, Lucretius says. Infinite ages passed in which you did not exist. Did that trouble you? Did the eternity of your non-existence before birth cause you a single moment of dread? Of course not. We regard the time before our birth with complete indifference, as a blank we cannot even conceive of minding. But that prenatal void and the post-mortem void are, in every relevant respect, identical. Both are states in which you simply are not. If the first costs you no anxiety, then, by the same reasoning, neither should the second. The asymmetry in our feelings has no basis in the facts. Lucretius called this the mirror that nature holds up to us. Look back before your birth, and see reflected the nothing that comes after. The fear, he suggests, is a kind of illusion of perspective, where we treat the future void as a loss and the past void as no loss at all, though they are the same emptiness. It is a beautiful piece of reasoning. But something still feels unaccounted for, and philosophers ever since have tried to name exactly what that something is. The strongest challenge to Epicurus was sharpened in the 20th century by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, in an essay simply titled Death, published in 1970. Nagel grants everything Epicurus says about experience. Death is not a bad experience, because it is not an experience at all. But, he argues, harm does not require experience. Something can be bad for you even when you are not around to feel it. Consider being betrayed by a friend behind your back, in a way you never discover. Nothing in your experience changes, and yet most of us feel you have been genuinely wronged. Or consider a brilliant person reduced by injury to the mental state of an infant, content and unaware. Their contentment does not stop us from calling it a tragedy. What these cases suggest is that a person can be deprived of goods, and that deprivation is a real harm, even without any felt suffering. Death, on this view, is bad not because of what we feel in it, but because of what it takes away, the future life we would otherwise have had. This is the deprivation account, and I think it is the most serious wound Epicurus's argument has ever taken. It concedes the logic and then relocates the harm to a place the logic never covered. So does Epicurus have a reply? He does, and it is quieter than you might expect. Here I have to make a correction, because I once thought Epicurus was simply defeated by the deprivation objection. I was wrong, or at least too quick. The Epicurean reply is not to deny that a longer life could contain more goods. It is to deny that there is any subject left to be deprived of them. Deprivation, they would insist, needs a subject who is deprived, and death removes that subject. There is no one, after death, for whom the missing future is a loss. This is where the argument reaches its true boundary, and being honest about that boundary is more useful than pretending it wins outright. What Epicurus can dissolve is the fear of death as a state we undergo, the 3 a.m. terror of sitting inside the darkness, aware of our own absence. That fear, he shows, rests on an incoherent picture. There is no such state, and no such awareness. What the argument may not fully dissolve is the sadness at a life cut short, the grief of goods unlived. But notice how much that concedes and how much it does not. It concedes that we may reasonably wish for more life. It does not concede that we should be afraid of death itself, because the thing we picture fearing does not exist. A wish for more is not the same as a terror of nothing, and separating the two is the practical heart of everything Epicurus taught. Suppose you accept even the modest version of the argument, that the state you dread is one you will never occupy. What changes in an ordinary life? Epicurus was explicit about this, and it is the reverse of what people assume. He did not think the argument would make you reckless or indifferent to living. He thought it would make you fully present to the life you have. In the letter to Menoeceus he writes that the wise person neither fears non-existence nor clings desperately to life, and this frees them to enjoy the actual day in front of them rather than to consume it worrying about its end. A man who has genuinely stopped fearing death, he argues, has removed the terror that made life feel like a countdown. The time you have stops being a resource draining toward a horror, and becomes simply the time you have. There is a scene worth imagining here. Two people at the same dinner, the same garden, the same evening. One is quietly haunted by the thought that all of this ends, and so cannot quite taste any of it. The other has set that fear down, having decided the ending is not an event to be suffered, and so is entirely inside the evening. Epicurus is describing the second person, and claiming the difference between them is not luck or temperament but a single corrected belief. That is a strong claim. It also gives us something concrete to practice. The real test of any philosophy of death is not the calm afternoon but the moment of actual crisis, the diagnosis, the accident narrowly avoided, the loss of someone close. And here Epicurus asks something demanding. He asks you to notice, in that moment, whether your fear is fear of a felt state or fear of an idea. When the mind panics at death, examine the panic. What exactly is it picturing? If you look closely, the argument predicts, you will find the mind picturing a version of you present at your own absence, watching, missing, regretting. That figure is a fiction, a ghost the imagination inserts because it literally cannot conceive of its own non-existence. The panic is real. Its object is not. This does not make grief foolish or love pointless, it makes the specific terror of your own annihilation a fear pointed at empty space. Epicurus's boldest claim, and the one I keep returning to, is that clarity here is not cold. He thought that a person freed from this fear would love life more, not less, because their attention would no longer be split between the present and a dreaded future that is not even coherent. I still catch myself failing this at 3 a.m., which is exactly why I think it's worth practicing. The last thing to do, then, is turn the whole argument into something you can actually use when the fear returns. The argument comes down to this. Death is not a state you enter and endure, it is the absence of any state at all, and the terror you feel is aimed at a picture your mind cannot help inserting itself into. Here is the practice, in 3 steps. First, when the fear rises, ask what it is picturing, and notice the phantom observer standing inside the darkness. Second, remove that observer, since death removes exactly them, and watch what is left of the fear. Third, turn back to the actual hour you are in, which is the only place you have ever existed or ever will. Epicurus did not promise you eternity. He offered something stranger and sturdier, the discovery that the thing you fear most is the one thing you will never have to meet. Philosophy is not an academic exercise. It is the art of living well. Subscribe if you want to keep at it. And if you want something concrete to take with you, there is a free Stoic starter kit in the description, 20 timeless quotes, a 7-day routine, and a printable journal. Any books mentioned today are also linked below.